aprovechando la nueva información sobre el crimen en la construcción de clasificaciones de delitos. Nos acompaña como moderador el señor Antonino de Leo, de la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito. Les recordamos que si tienen preguntas a los ponentes, utilicen las hojas de preguntas incluidas en su kit de bienvenida.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos, un gusto saludarles. Es para mí un honor poder moderar esta sesión que tiene por título Aprovechando la nueva información sobre el crimen en la construcción de clasificaciones de delitos. Y como nuestros ponentes son inglés hablantes, quisiera seguir en inglés y recomendaría a todos los participantes que puedan, por favor, tomar asiento. Estamos a punto de empezar esta primera sesión. Un agradecimiento muy especial al INEI por su hospitalidad y a todas las instituciones que han hecho posible esta conferencia. A warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for being with us. We are about to start the first session of this conference, which is entitled Taking Advantage of New Information on Crime in Building Crime Classifications. It is an honor for me to be moderating this session, which brings together 4 distinguished scholars and researchers. I would like to give the floor first to Mr. Jim Lynch from the University of Maryland, who is going to present a paper written by Lynn Addington from the American University entitled Alternative Classifications of Common Law Crime, Suggestions of the Crime Indicator Working Group. Jim Lynch is professor and former chair of the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, as well as director of the Maryland Data Analysis Center. He joined the department after serving as a director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the United States Department of Justice. You can read his full biography in the program. He's kindly accepted to present a paper written by Lynn Addington, which includes an analysis of the indicators identified by the crime indicator working groups. And these indicators complement the index classification and use more fully the incident level information. It is a great pleasure to have him here, and I would like to give him the floor. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I want to say at the outset that Lynn Addington was supposed to present this, but Lynn couldn't come, so you have the second team doing this. So I'd also like to thank the logistical people, Salome, of course, but also some of the people here on the scene, because we've switched order and done a number of things, and they have kept up with it in a terrific way. So I want to thank them as well. So I know this sounds like a very exciting paper. And I can see the sort of glaze on your eye already, but I think it really bespeaks a sort of a larger issue that for many years, or for most of the existence of crime statistics have been identified by the type of crime classification that people used. And so it was no accident that Angela and her colleagues set out to define that new crime classification. Jonathan Calkins is in the audience, and Alex Piquero is going to talk later. In the United States, we had a panel for the National Academy of Science and the first report on modernizing crime statistics, and the first report of that thing was to define a type of crime classification. And so for most of the existence of crime statistics, it was an aggregate system where you presented an aggregate count. And so that the idea of collection, so what you collect, was defined by that type of crime classification. And that was also what you presented. So you presented what you collected. There was a one-for-one kind of exchange and that kind of thing. But the era has changed, I think. Now, we've moved in many countries to incident-based collection, so that we collect a great deal of detailed information on every single event. And then you are free to present whatever you choose from that set of events. So the unity between what you collect, the type of crime classification that you collect, and the type of crime classification that you present, that unity is broken at this point in time. And I think the genesis for this sort of presentation on my part comes from the experience of the United States, where we have moved 20 years ago to incident-based data collection for crime statistics. But we have kept the same major type of crime classification that we used in 1929, when people were doing this by pencil and paper. And so I think we need to be, so it's very frustrating to see us have all this information, but have done very little about utilizing that additional information in the presentation of the data that we have. So I think that what I'd like to do today, this is sort of a recruitment poster. I would like to recruit people to take on the task with all, great respect for all the things that Angela and Alan Beck and Mario, all those people have done sort of to bring this type of crime classification, and it is a huge advancement. But even here, as well as in the incident collection, I think we need to turn our attention to not so much the collection aspects, which are well in hand, but to the presentational aspects. So what I'd like to do today is to present a few disaggregations of the statistics that we have in the United States coming out of the NIBRS data collection, to try and interest you in the idea of beginning this exploration of developing additional crime classifications where we've disaggregated things. Now I'm asking you to reaggregate things. Reaggregate them in new ways that can complement the major crime classification that's used to organize data collection. And so I think there's room for these lesser indices. And so what I'm going to try and do today is show you some different ways that you can look at the data, hopefully get your interest in doing the serious work that's required to utilize this newly disaggregated information in a way that truly informs us about the crime problem. So let me try and do this. There it is. I think that I just made this point about aggregate crime classifications and the distinction. I think in the United States we have, I'm going to use this as an example, in the United States we've had the longest standing data collection on crime that we have is one which is collected by the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it is an aggregate system where people send in, local police departments send in aggregate counts on 7 major crimes: homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft. These are all serious crimes, prevalent, and presumably well reported to the police. But that's all you get. You get these counts by jurisdiction of those particular acts. And so in 1986 or so, a report was published and a program begun, which was to begin incident-based classification. This was a massive expansion of the kind of information that you collect on crime on a routine basis. So it was incident-based. So every event had its record. It wasn't an attribute, an aggregate, jurisdiction-based reporting. So they expanded the number of crimes from the 7 that you saw to 42. And they collected a great deal of information on victims, offenders, social consequences of crime. Much of the things that you see in the ICCS attributes that are there, many of those are also included in NIBRS. So, but again, when they instituted NIBRS, they didn't pay any attention to the business of how do we present. And what we've ended up doing for the last 20 years is taking this attribute-rich database, chopping it up, and presenting it as the 7 old index crimes. Okay, and so this is what has driven me mad for 10 years, and Angela has given me an opportunity to vent my frustrations. So I think, when I was director of BJS, when we started to push the idea of incident-based collection, trying to resurrect this old dinosaur that had started in '86, but we wanted to do it on a sample base so we could bring it to fruition sooner. We created a group of police executives from all the major police organizations in the United States, and we posed the challenge to them. We say, what crime indicators would you advocate? How would you assess the crime problem? How would you assess how you're doing? That's the challenge we gave them, and they really responded quite well, I think, to this particular problem, because they came up with a great deal of innovative ideas about how we could use incident-based data in a more creative way. The idea was to, let me talk about 3 or so of the themes that they brought up. Well, one of the things is measuring harms and threats, not directly through the criminal code. So each of those crime classifications, robbery, aggravated assault, has a certain set of attributes that are built into the criminal code in that sense. But some of them are mixed. So aggravated assault includes severe bodily injury from fisticuffs and other things, also weapon threats, and the use of a weapon that doesn't result in a fatality. And so these kinds of things are spread across robbery, spread across, so they're almost invisible in the crime classification. And the police say, in the United States, handguns are important. We want a crime classification that gives prominence to handguns first. And so that's one thing they were pretty absolute on. Take it out of these other categories. Estimates of injury and harm that were direct and not inferred. So aggravated assault is supposed to be serious, but it includes weapon threats where someone may even discharge the weapon, miss you, so you're not harmed at all, though I wouldn't advocate that as a daily activity, but I think it's kind of this kind of, so there's a lot of heterogeneity in there. The second thing that they talked about was social contexts of crime, so that citizens could put themselves in that situation and begin to understand whether that situation is a risky situation or not. And so street crime, which is the quintessential crime in the imagination of the American public, crime among strangers in a public place, okay? You've got robbery, you've got aggravated assault, they can be anywhere. All you have to be in the denominator of those rates is to be a citizen. Or not even a citizen, a resident at that particular point in time. So the idea of making locations and activities that people are engaged in part of the crime classification or visible in the crime indicators was another thing that they advocated. The other thing that they were really adamant about was monitoring the risk to more vulnerable populations. So they were child victims, the elderly, which they define as 65, but I beg to differ, I think, in that. Also, things like commercial victims, A lot of crime is against commercial entities, a good chunk of robbery, but when citizens see the robbery rate, they think it's them at risk and not corporations and so on. So all of these kinds of clarifications are things that the Crime Indicators Working Group. So what we did is we took some of the data from the National Incident-Based Reporting System that the FBI has started to develop and tried to present them, pulling out these attributes that the chiefs thought were important and giving them prominence. So this takes a look at gun crime, for example. So you see the green is aggravated assault, which everybody associates with sometimes with guns, sometimes not. So I think the good news is that the indicators of robbery and aggravated assault gives you a much more inflated idea of gun use because they're hidden in those places. So if you pull them out, there's actually quite the idea of the use of the blue bars. The use of guns is much too prevalent, but the use of handguns, I should say, but at the same time, it's much less than what would be seen in those traditional crime classifications. I think major injury. So major injury is lurking in aggravated assault someplace, but when you pull out major injuries, which are broken bones, missing teeth, concussions, and so on, fairly substantial kinds of things, again, you get the sense from this that it's not nearly as big a deal as was led to believe in those traditional crime classifications. So some of the idea of pulling out the degree of injury and harm is an important, gives you somewhat of a different picture of crime and those things. Here's something where we looked at property crime. That's the blue bar there, is the property crime counted as incidents. And then we took a look at these things in terms of average loss. What strikes me most here in the red bars is that these crimes on average have a tremendous loss associated with them. Of course, that's driven by a few large events, and so when you look at the green bar, which is the median loss, it's still that these things are not trivial events. It's not a bunch of people stealing bicycles. These are significant events that become apparent when you start to look at the actual dollar value and loss of these things. I think that the other thing, I'm trying to talk fast because I'm way over the limit here. I think associating risk with social context. We took a look at street crime, for example. So if you look at street crime here, you see the UCR Violent Crime Index, which traditionally used to measure violence, a lot of it associated with street. That street violence is really quite a small portion of that violence. And so people are doing a lot better in these public places than people think they are. The other thing, the opposite part of the extreme is interpersonal violence. This is violence among intimates in the home. So it gives you another idea of the places where people are at risk and where policing is either doing its job or not doing its job. So it makes that quite visible. I think the other thing is monitoring special populations. We took a look at children under 12. This is a sort of an interesting kind of ratio. If you look at North Dakota, the blue bar is the ratio of the victimization of children using the appropriate denominator, which is and as a ratio of the victimization of the public in general. So what it says to me is North Dakota is a great place for dependent populations because the victimization rate for these dependent populations is a small fraction of what it is for these other populations. And so the other thing it says is that us old folks are safer than young folks, which makes, because we stay home a lot. I think that might be the reason why. But the idea that these different populations have very different risk rates, and the police were very adamant that this is a way for them to, they're very keen on this. If you do a good job in those populations, or if you have a problem in those populations, that's something that you should attend to, something that the public should know, kind of thing. So this is commercial and residential property. These are property crimes. So you can see that a large chunk of property crime has really commercial victims, and that the green bar being the residential crime. And it also varies quite a bit from place to place. Now, we don't know why that is in terms of responsibility and so on, but I think this is something, again, that's invisible in the normal type of crime classifications. So the last thing I want to say is that developing these things is a two-pronged kind of approach. You have to do a lot of work because you have to make distinctions that people think are important, get their feedback to distinguish those distinctions that are going to become a prominent feature of reporting and those that are not. So that's what I tried to do right now in a very quick way, but the idea, a more thorough way of saying, Here's what's being hidden in these crime classifications. Is this important enough to be revealed as a separate indicator itself? But as Al Bitterman, my mentor and friend, would say, a lot's going on in the denominator. And so that when we're thinking about developing these new type of crime classifications, we have to think about the denominator as well, because it's quite revealing. Because not everybody's at risk in the same place at the same time, but what do we use as a denominator? The residential population. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I think if you look at school, which is very salient here in the United States, and the last year has not been good for school. I think that population-based school rates are the blue bar, which would say school's the safest place in the world. And then you have street crime locations, okay, which are much, much higher than the school crime, the green bar that you see there. But then, we took the denominator from school enrollment figures and from teachers and put them in the denominator of the school rate, and the school rate's looking a lot like the street rate in many places. So that the green bar and the red bar, when you take enrollment based, this can be done for a whole variety of things. I tried to do it for the commercial crimes, but the denominators were just too sloppy to use. But so this is revealing. You know, this is a whole different picture of risk at school when you take this kind of thing. And I want to advocate this kind of work, that as long as the world was in an aggregate data collection mode, collection defined presentation. I think in the new world of incident-based statistics, and even in the new world of the ICCS, not everybody's going to have incident-based classifications, but if you can meet the ICCS criteria, you have enough contextual variables that were not there before to begin to use in this kind of exploration, so that we give as much attention to the idea of presentation as we have to the idea of collection. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks very much for this very interesting presentation, for refining for unveiling what we were not be able to see until very recently. I think this is an important contribution, and I would like to thank also on behalf of UNODC the work that Jim Lynch has been doing in supporting this international conference and the work of the Center of Excellence of UNODC in Mexico. I would like to give the floor now to Michael Levy. He's been professor of criminology at Cardiff University since 1991, conducting international research on the control of white-collar and organized crime, corruption, and money laundering, financing of terrorism since 1972. He has published widely on this subject, as well as editing major journals. In 2013, he was given the Distinguished Scholar Award by the International Association for the Study of Organized Crime, and in 2014 he was awarded the Selling Look Prize for International and Comparative Criminology by the American Society of Criminology. He's currently writing books on white-collar crimes and their victims, and on the organization of white-collar crimes. He is here to present a paper entitled Measuring Crimes, the challenge of cyber-related crimes and fraud victimization. And this paper reviews the principal difficulties in measuring cyber-related crimes and how they have been handled to date in a range of countries. Thanks very much for being with us, Michael.
Thank you very much. So one of the problems that we always have in these kind of new areas is what are we going to measure and why? And first of all, I want to talk about the politics of measurement, because you know, when we face changes, why do we want to adjust? Your minister gave us a very clear account and a very intelligent account of why Peru is changing. And I'll just briefly talk about the UK and cybercrime. And it's not just the UK. I will be talking about one of the pressures for us to measure cybercrime is partly because cybercrime is a problem, but it's also because the government was criticized because crime had been falling, and people said, it's not really falling, it's really rising because you are suppressing the rise in cybercrime. And therefore, you are making yourself look better than you really are at controlling crime. And so that's part of the political ambience between the rise of cybercrime measurement. Against that, there is the psychology of crime statisticians, which is usually quite conservative. As I put it to my committee, you have a choice. We can keep a historic time series, or you can actually try to measure the crime that is around you. You can't do both, because these new forms of crime, there's cyber-dependent crime, which is crimes like hacking into your computer, that require a computer. And there is cyber-enabled crime, like frauds that are committed over the internet, which could have happened anyway. So crime statisticians like to keep a continuous series, but in this case, it's just not possible. So are you going to do measures of frequency? And what about the victims? We know from violent crime, particularly domestic violence, that multiple victimization is a very important issue, likewise with corruption. And similarly with cybercrime, it's very important to understand how many people are multiple victims, because you might want to intervene with them to teach them ways of being less victimized. And then there are measures of cost and harm, which in many countries, we heard in the last session, some interesting data about cost, but in many countries cost is not taken into account. But then we have the problem of harm, because the cost to a rich person of $1,000 fraud may be quite modest because they can afford it. But the cost of $100 to a poor person may be much more significant because they cannot. So you need to think about impacts as well as just financial costs. And how do you do that? Then we have the question, does harm involve fear? Fear of crime is important. It's important to the minister's credibility. If people are more fearful, even though that's irrational, that's why one of the reasons why we need to have good data. But the fear of fraud is often an underestimated thing, or the fear that every time you turn on your computer, somebody is going to try and hack you. And that's important for business. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, then the prosperity of business, I was struck 35 years ago, we did a study, and some local people said, what's the most serious type of crime? They said, burglary of businesses. I said, you sure you mean that's the most serious crime? I said, yes. Because of burglary of businesses, there aren't any businesses around here because the risks are too great. And we know now that so much business is dependent on access to computing, and to sales on the internet, that this can have a very big effect if we are not careful. So fear of internet crime is quite important. And we need finally to deconstruct and dismantle a lot of the hype around cybercrime. There's a kind of lot of theatre of security, partly because cyber security firms are trying to sell us services. How do we know whether these services are worth what we are paying for them? There is a lot of market failure in this area that we need to be careful. We are not paying for stuff that is useless, and we are not really paying for things that are useful. Some threats. There's quite a lot of variegated landscape from cyber and cryptocurrencies. This relates also to money laundering, which Peter Reuter will be talking about later. But people are talking all the time about Bitcoin and stuff like this as a big threat. But the proportion of illicit trade that is conducted in this way might be quite small. And it's important to be sensible. But certainly one of the things that we are finding is that cybersecurity is becoming part of the new warfare issue, and now while you are driving by hacking into the electronics. So people get scared. Even your toaster may be a way of injuring you. One of the things that we do know from the data is that a lot of people are the victims of data theft and breaches of data security. 143 million Americans, that's a lot of people. By that, by the way, they mean North Americans, not you and not me. Were the victims of breaches of security in Equifax. This is what are they doing with that data? Often they are not doing anything with it, but it still alarms people, the feeling of insecurity. And this brings me to the question, well, how do we make cost-benefit decisions in practice? There are also alternative survey sources that we can use in measuring fraud and cybercrime. This is just an example by Kroll, the American, the international security firm. One of the problems that we have with these survey sources is they don't often tell us what the refusal rate is. They usually just give us the number of companies that they have surveyed in different countries. And as every good statistician knows, if you don't have data about refusal rates or rejection rates, or who they tried to get hold of, it's very difficult to make proper sense of this data. But you can see from this, fraud rates seem to be going up. A lot of it, these are companies that are victims, seem to be thinking that this was quite a significant event in their life. And there's a global risk map which looks at the percentage of companies in these different places that were hit. And you'll see that those percentages are quite low by cybercrime, but it creates an ambience of fear, but we need to think about, we need to try and force the private security companies and firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers to reveal what their refusal rates are if we're going to make proper statistical sense of the data. So if we say how much e-crime and of what kinds, then there are various kinds of attempts to produce estimates. And frankly, most people rightly don't believe this data because those cost data are usually produced in such a way that they're just aggregated up and people don't know how much it's actually cost them. We need to get a lot better about that. If we're talking about surveying companies, if you're an international company, how do you know what proportion of your losses occur in Peru? It's often not asked, but if you are trying to do national data on corporations, it's important to try and think about where those losses are generated rather than just where the headquarters of the company is. And there is the problem of facts by repetition, and I've got a cartoon there by Dilbert, who is saying, you know, figures you make up are no less valid than the figures that are real, basically. And one of the questions is, what can the UN and associates do to assist data collection in these areas? So to wind up, when we're thinking about measuring cybercrimes and frauds, we need to think, well, are we just going to go for individuals or are we going to go for companies? If we're going to go for companies, are we just going to measure small or very big companies? Big companies are the easiest to do, but small companies may be more important for your economies because they employ typically a lot more people. And there are issues of time lags in knowledge that you need to take account of. Then as far as official crime statistics are concerned, and I'll go into the British one in a moment, you know, national and international efforts, the countries that have made the most effort in this are the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, and the US. And we may want to know, coming back to Jim's point about the depth of field and richness, how are the crimes committed? Are they using cyber techniques? But very often we have analysed and we found that a lot of online crimes also use offline crimes at some stage. So it's not just online versus offline, it's a combination if we are trying to defraud people or not. And we also might want to have crimes handled by non-police agencies like tax and social security. So to conclude, the UK has made quite a lot of efforts in its crime survey for England and Wales. One of the things it has done is to concentrate also reports to the police nationally in a central way in the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. And that provides us with a better aggregate picture, because one of the things about cyber frauds and indeed other kinds of frauds is that they may affect people in different parts of the country and indeed in different countries. So you need to find ways of trying to cluster that data together. There are some problems in the way the UK has done this. And one of them lies in getting feedback from the different police bodies who get past these crime reports, because police are not normally very keen on feeding back what they are doing because they see it as a pointless act. So you have to try and encourage them to produce feedback, otherwise you don't have a good data set. But it does at least enable us to, now that we have experimented with this, we're also getting a lot of more cooperation between public and private bodies. So one of the things the UK has done is that we have centralized bodies who collect, in the private sector, who collect information about credit card fraud and also other kinds of fraud. And this is now included in the national estimates of cybercrime and of fraud. And this has been very helpful in increasing the value and credibility. So one of the challenges for many countries here is to get the private sector to cooperate and give true data to the public about these new crimes. It's easier in the UK because we have a data protection rule that enables data to be shared between companies and the government for the purpose of crime prevention. And that is the lesson that I want to end on, otherwise I will overstay my time even more. That these things are possible, but you need to think about how to get better data and more honest data from the private sector, because they are holding a lot of the data on cybercrimes and other types of fraud. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much to Michael Levy for helping us understanding the importance of measuring cybercrimes and frauds, and sharing with us efforts made by the UK to improve ways to tackle cyber-related crimes and frauds. Thanks very much. It is a pleasure now to give the floor to Peter Reuter. He's professor in the School of Public Policy and the Department of Criminology at the University of Maryland. He founded and directed RAND's Drug Policy Research Center from 1989 to 1993. From 2007 to 2011, he served as the first president of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy. He's presenting a very interesting paper called Fuzzy Crime, Money Laundering, Drug Selling and Organized Crime. And we are very pleased to have you here, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The term fuzzy crimes is fuzzy. It was intended to suggest that there were issues with each of these three, organized crime, money laundering, and drug offenses, that were more than just the problems of how do you count. They're really quite serious conceptual problems. I will, in the end, not talk about drugs just because the paper turned out to be too ambitious for a 15-minute presentation, and there are lots of drug panels, including one that I'll be chairing on Tuesday. But with respect to organized crime, the central issue I want to raise is that the definition remains elusive and I think not going to get resolved, and that we need to find sort of some very pragmatic indicators related to harms. And the fuzziness with money laundering is that maybe money laundering is in fact not a very serious crime. We have anti-money laundering statutes which provide useful tools the same way that conspiracy laws provide investigators and prosecutors with useful ways of going after crime, but we wouldn't call conspiracy a source of harm itself, and that has implications for how we go about deciding what's worth measuring about money laundering. So, usual beginning, these are problems which are perceived to be growing, both organized crime and money laundering. Money laundering, we have this sort of repeated revelations that money flows to places that we label tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions. It is always useful to remember that the island with the largest quantity of laundered money is undoubtedly Manhattan, but we put that aside. The public is repeatedly reminded that money laundering is a problem every time some autocrat, kleptocrat falls. We discover that there's a huge amount of money that was sent overseas and stored in some form of money laundering. So the problem is constantly in the public mind. Whether in fact the problem is growing is another issue, but it certainly is a prominent one. With respect to organized crime, speaking as an American scholar and an observer, it's a problem that has become quite minor in the US public mind. On the other hand, transnational organized crime is a label that's put on all sorts of problems of growing prominence: human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, fraud, counterfeit. And I should note, as a preliminary to my efforts to make some progress on how we might go about measuring these things, that the very admirable and comprehensive National Academy of Sciences report called Modernizing Crime Statistics says nothing about organized crime or money laundering. So I take that to suggest that there are challenges that others would prefer not to deal with, perhaps quite sensibly. So the definition of organized crime is still contentious. Legal definitions vary a lot across countries. I'll present a couple as examples. They're often very simplistic, 3 or more gathered together to commit financial crimes on a regular basis or something like that. It's not as though academics have solved this problem and it's merely the foolish lawmakers. Academics are at least as divided about what constitutes organized crime. Federico Varese, whom I regard as leading figure in organized crime research, emphasizes monopoly control of illegal markets. I do not think that that's the right way of approaching it, but it's sort of interesting contrast to others who focus much more on the notion of hierarchy and continuing organization. Klaus van Lampe at John Jay College has a website which, when I last looked a few months ago, had 180 definitions from statutes and scholarly articles. Even a question is organized crime a label for organization or for activity? And the definitions really come out of specific historical conditions. I started work in this area in the late 70s, and there was an image then of the American mafia as dominant. Donald Cressy, a very distinguished criminologist in other areas, I would say, wrote a very strident book called Theft of a Nation, and it was seen as organized crime, the mafia, the American mafia was seen as this large confederation, very powerful both in political and in sort of criminal justice influence. And the definitions that emerged at that period, very much trying to capture that definition, and very consistent with what was emerging then as the sort of distinctive characteristics of the Sicilian mafia, though in the sense that the organized crime there was seen as providing a distinctive sort of infrastructure facilitating particular kinds of crime. The best statement of this is Diego Gambetta's book on the Sicilian mafia from the 1990s. I think that sort of captures ideas that have been around for about 20 years there. So should the definition in fact be fitted to the threats that clearly vary across countries? We were talking about Tajikistan or Albania. The emphasis would be on the connections between organized crime and the political system. One view of Tajikistan is that in the 1990s, two sides agreed to divide the drug traffic, and that's sort of been the base of the political system ever since. On the other hand, for Mexico, it's less the connection between organised crime and politics than it is organised crime and its the extent of violence and the intimidation of the police, as well as the corruption of the police. And I'll come to what I think is the useful insight about how to do measurement in this area, where using some piece of research about the UK, which also emphasises intimidation as the sort of central harm that one might want to measure. Let me give you a sense of the sort of kinds of definitions that have emerged. So this was the sort of the first statutory definition in the US, emerged after various congressional hearings that established that the Italian mafia, that the American mafia was a real threat. And here we have a definition which is sort of largely a list of activities, supplying illegal goods and services, including but not limited to gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, narcotics, labor racketeering. If you were putting together a list now, gambling and labor racketeering essentially disappeared as activities in the US, and it points to the problem of providing lists which get outdated both because of changes in society, changes in law, changes in technology, etc. The FBI has now a more a sort of more abstract definition, but it really reads more like a description than it does a definition. I mean, when we talk about generally have a, the last phrase, such groups such groups maintain their position through the use of actual or threatened violence, corrupt public officials, graft or extortion, and generally have a significant impact on the people as they, and in their locales, region, or the country as a whole. This is more like a description of a phenomenon they'd like to deal with. The European Union, of course, has a much more bureaucratic definition. So here we have 11 criteria. You need 6, but there are 4 mandatory ones, and consensus is achieved amongst 28 different countries as a consequence of that. I'm not saying it's a bad definition, it's just sort of, it's so broad that you're not sure what you actually are describing. And in fact, when you look at Europol, I gather the definition may have a dated version of this definition, but when Europol talks about the 5,000 organized crime groups, international organized crime groups that it is currently investigating, it turns out that most of them have a hierarchical characteristic, but there are 20% that are short-term ventures, and suddenly you feel, I missed something in this definition. Short-term ventures and organized crime don't really accord with our sense of a very distinctive threat. I skipped over the notion that we care about organized crime because we may be willing to give the state unusual powers to deal with this particular threat, this particularly dangerous threat. In the case of the US, wiretap authority really arose from a concern about organized crime. In Maxi trials in Italy, I think, were an organized crime innovation. I mean, so you want to have something distinctive. You start talking about short-term ventures, it's hard to think that the organized crime label really is meaningful. And then we come to the UK, which reports 4,600 organized crime groups. And you say, 4,600 doesn't sort of accord with our notion of a distinctive threat. Sounds more like gangs, and when you look at the definition, it's sort of pretty vague. Organized crime is serious, planned, coordinated, and conducted by people working together on a continuing basis. Their motivation is often, but not always, financial gain. For that, if it was, let's say there were a bunch of mergers and we only had 2,300. Would that be progress? And, I mean, it's pretty clear that that's not the right way of thinking about it. You don't want to just count. All right. Well, so far I've just described challenges. Response to the challenge. Paolo Campana, who's sitting in the audience here from Cambridge, and Federico Varese from Oxford, just recently published a really interesting article which for the first time, it seems to me, has tackled the issue of could we come up with a way of measuring harms related to organised crime? And after all, that's what we care about, the distinctive harms. I mean, maybe organised crime is important for drug trafficking and prostitution and human trafficking, but we measure those separately. What is it that's distinctive about organised crime as a problem? And what they suggest is that, and this comes from their interviews with police, is that organised crime in this sort of these small, 4,600 of them in the UK, in these small things, is really a threat to local authority. No one would claim that the national government has a problem with organised crime affecting its capacity to govern, but at the local level, perhaps there is. And what they did in 2 jurisdictions was survey the police using an instrument, which I'll show you in a moment, from the British Crime Survey, concerning the ability of each organised crime group to generate fear in the community, to coerce legal businesses, and their expression is to influence official figures. It isn't corruption, it was sort of about, well, would organised crime groups, for example, be able to influence who got favours from local government. And they developed an instrument which comes out of the British Crime Survey, asking these specific questions on a 5-point scale. And what's interesting is to see the results of that. So this was in Derbyshire, there had been 55 organised crime groups had been identified. And here we see the results of how many fell into, on each of the 5 sort of levels of the 5-point scale for each of the 3 dimensions of intimidation. And of course, in most cases, the group did not have, had no coercive power. But there were some that did have at least a moderate amount of influence, and when you aggregated them, so it could go from 0 to a maximum of 15, what you saw that there were 3 of the 55 groups actually had achieved medium power across these 3 dimensions. Most had achieved low, but not 0. I mean, 20 out of the 55 had no coercive power, 32 had low, but 3 of them had moderate. Now, this is just one dimension, but it starts the process of trying to develop low-cost ways that could be routinely used to capture what I think might be some of the most important dimensions of organised crime and get away from worrying about definitions where you have this constant tension between something that's sort of conceptually strong and can be operationalized by police agencies. And so I think this is the beginning of a useful research agenda, and I will say nothing about money laundering now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to Peter Reuter. Thank you for explaining the complexities of measuring money laundering, drug selling, and organized crime, and mentioning this important contribution of Campana and Varese, as well as Legal Governance Index, and helping us to capture some of the most important dimensions of organized crime. Before moving to the last presentation, I would like to remind you that all participants have the opportunity to put forward questions to the distinguished scholars that are here with us today. So I would like to invite you to do so, to write your name and surname, as well as your question. Y a todos los participantes quisiera recordar que tienen la oportunidad de formular sus preguntas y les invitamos a hacerlo. Aquí están nuestras compañeras que las pueden recolectar. And it is a pleasure to introduce the final speaker. Ella Cockbain is a lecturer lecturer at the Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London. Her main research interests are in the use of quantitative techniques to examine and alleviate crime problems, focusing in particular on spatial and temporal crime patterns and evaluation methods. She's here to present a paper entitled Applying Data Science Techniques to Human Trafficking Research. And the aim of this paper is to improve the measurement and understanding of human trafficking. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here today. I'm going to be presenting some research that myself and my colleague Kate Bowers at UCL have been doing on using data science techniques to improve our understanding and intervention in human trafficking. And I'd also like to thank the UK's National Crime Agency, who made this project possible through sharing their data and facilitating the research. So really I'm going to talk about 3 pathways to achieving better evidence on human trafficking. The first is about taking a more disaggregated approach and acknowledging the variety within human trafficking. The second is about looking at context and contextual factors more deeply. And the third is about being more geographically specific. So for the first, looking at variety, we asked the research question of whether the characteristics of individual trafficking victims and their trafficking cases could predict what trafficking type they'd been involved in. And we used data from the UK's National Referral Mechanism, which is a national system for identifying victims of human trafficking. We had about 5.5 years worth of data with over 2,600 victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, for domestic servitude, so exploitation within the home, and for other forms of labour exploitation, which are the 3 main types of human trafficking that we encounter in the UK. And we started with an exploratory data analysis and then moved on to a multinomial logistic regression in order to control and examine the interactions between the variables. And we had data on a range of different variables relating to individual trafficking victims, their experiences of trafficking, and official responses to them. And so to show you a sense of what happens when you start to take a more disaggregated approach, let's start by looking at victims' gender. So over here, the column on the left is female victims, and the column on the right is male victims. And that's when you look at human trafficking as a whole, as experienced by the UK. So about 62% female. However, when you break it down and you look by sex, domestic servitude and labour, you can see that for both sex and domestic servitude, the vast majority of victims are female. However, for labour, which is the bottom one there, the trend completely reverses and you see about 80% of the victims are male, which then starts to call into question whether responses to human trafficking that have developed historically very much around improving protection of women and children are going to be as adequate when you're dealing with something like labour trafficking. We see very similar patterns when you start to disaggregate by region of origin. So, sorry, this room's probably a little bit too big for this graph. But if you look at domestic servitude, say, the vast majority of victims encountered in the UK come from Africa and Asia, whereas labour trafficking, we see very few from those regions comparatively, and the majority of victims come from within the EU. And if you think about this in sort of logical terms, that's likely to be in part because of freedom of movement within the EU. So for traffickers, it's much easier to exploit and to put to work people who already have the right to come into the UK and to work in the UK. And that raises questions about how that might change post-Brexit. And then what we did next, having looked at these variables in isolation, was to combine them into a model, because obviously there may be interactions between them. And what we found was the overall model in which the outcome variable was trafficking type was highly significant and it had a good fit. It correctly predicted about 80% of cases. And a very small number of variables were significant predictors, and that was things like victims' gender, victims' age, the region they came from, the region they were identified in the UK, and the source of referral, so the means by which they came to the attention of the authorities. And the implications of this type of approach are very clear, which is that a much more nuanced and disaggregated approach to intervening in human trafficking is needed. And rather than sort of assuming that what works for one type, typically sex, will work for the other types as well. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to move on to talk exclusively about human trafficking for labour exploitation, which is an area of growing importance both in the UK and internationally, and one for which the evidence base is particularly limited. So we conducted a systematic review recently of the European evidence base on labour trafficking and found that there was just a handful of empirical studies that met sort of rudimentary scientific criteria, and particular gaps around quantitative evidence, particular gaps around evaluation of what works in intervening to prevent and disrupt labour trafficking. So looking at the question of examining context more deeply, we asked a series of interlinked questions, so things like, who are the victims of human trafficking? Who are the offenders? How are victims recruited and exploited and controlled? What are the pathways into and out of trafficking? And our source here was in-depth victim case files for a total of 453 confirmed victims of labour trafficking from 2012 and 2013. The analysis is ongoing, so the results I'm about to present come from the 2012 cases only. And these were all European cases, which amount for about 4/5 of the total labour trafficking problem in the UK in those years. We were unable to get access to the non-European cases. And we used a variety of analyses. So very quickly, the basic demographic of the victims, it will come as no surprise at this point, 81% were male, about 94% were adults. A large proportion came from 3 countries in particular, all fairly new EU member states, so Poland, Lithuania and Slovakia. We were also able to piece together from across the victims' case files a much fuller picture of the offenders involved in human trafficking in the UK than has previously been possible. So that was quite exciting. Seeing about 350 offenders implicated in the abuse of these 170 victims. About 77% of them were males, so a fairly significant female minority. Similar average age, sort of mid to late 20s, but going from about 17 up to 60. Diverse nationalities, often but not always the same nationality as the bulk of the victims they were exploiting. And interestingly, about half of the offenders had a familial link to another trafficker with whom they were involved, which really highlights the importance of social networks as a pathway into trafficking, not just for victims, but for offenders as well. So, returning back to the victims and looking now just at the adult victims, we can see that there's some really strong contextual factors affecting their vulnerability to trafficking. And at this point, I should pause and say that we had problems with missing data, because what we were doing is we were working with largely qualitative data, so individual victim case files that could range from a few dozen pages to several hundred, but in a largely unstructured format. So a lot of the things of research interest weren't necessarily in there, or were in there in some cases, but not in others. So what that means is the statistics here have very variable denominators. So they're all based on cases where known, but that ranged from about 30% of the cases some of these factors were known for, up to about 99% of cases. So a large proportion of victims of labour trafficking were unemployed at the time of recruitment. A large proportion were homeless at the time of recruitment. Most spoke little or no English. So you can start to see that sort of contextual web of factors where it really starts to make sense why someone might respond to the offer of a job. The majority were trafficked alongside other victims, and of those, about a quarter had a familial link to someone else they were trafficked with. So again, that kind of kinship factor coming through is very important. 85% of them were trafficked into the UK, the rest were purely domestic or internal cases. And of those who came into the UK, all of them entered legally. And this type of insight is very important from the perspective of prevention, because traditionally a lot of discussion around trafficking focuses on, right, what can we do at border? Whereas actually for something like labour trafficking, with the picture as it is, there's very little that can be done at border, especially for EU cases. In terms of recruitment, despite growing interest in the use of job adverts to recruit victims into labour trafficking, actually we found that in-person recruitment was still very much the most kind of common approach. And similar proportions of victims were recruited by strangers as through members of their immediate or extended social networks. So once again, this idea of the kind of connections in which you're embedded being an important sort of risk factor for abuse comes through very clearly. The average salary that people were offered at recruitment was about £275 a week, but fairly big range. And the vast majority of labour trafficking victims agreed to a job offer. So absolutely none of them in this sample were recruited by abduction, threat or force, so the kind of hard end of the spectrum of exploitative or manipulative factors, but all of them were recruited by deception. And the deception was most commonly around the level of pay that they would receive and the state of the living conditions, although there were various other deceptions as well, like, for example, how much work would be available, how long they'd be expected to work for, and so forth. But this factor that deception features so much more heavily than the kind of harder forms of manipulation is very important, because deception is far less widely understood. So what you get then is when the victims are coming forward, because in many cases they did come forward, a lot of misunderstanding around what had happened and whether that genuinely constituted sort of criminal abuse, or whether it was, as many victims were told by the authorities, just a civil matter, you know, something to take to your embassy. In terms of the industries in which victims were exploited, again, we start to see the importance of taking a more nuanced and disaggregated approach. So there's a real kind of variance. The most common by far was agriculture, but interestingly, the second and third most common ways in which victims were exploited are things that haven't traditionally been so closely associated with human trafficking, and that's benefit fraud, so taking out state benefits in victims' names, and other use and abuse of their identity, so most commonly to take out, for example, mobile phone contracts or quite hefty bank loans. More than half of victims were exploited across multiple industries, which again starts to paint a picture of traffickers operating as sort of profit maximizers and trying to get as much money through as many different businesses as they could. And on average, victims were receiving around £10 a week, which you compare back to that sort of £275 they'd been promised. Various different control mechanisms used to exploit the victims, some of which are fairly well known in the trafficking field, like, for example, living in accommodation controlled by the offenders or having movement to and from work controlled. Others which haven't attracted very much attention so far, like many of the labour trafficking victims had their own bank accounts and they were paid legally into the bank accounts and they were receiving national minimum wage, but they didn't have access to their bank accounts because the cards had been taken away and someone else was controlling them. So starting to see kind of the importance of understanding in more detail what's going on. Again, victims' identification documents being taken away from them was very common, but it was only very common as a temporary measure. Very few of these victims lost their ID in the long run. So finally, the last bit was looking about being more geographically specific. And for that, we asked, where exactly are the places that labour trafficking victims are recruited and moved and housed and exploited and identified? And we used the same data set, so these in-depth victim case files, pulling out all the geographical information we could to permit crime mapping using geographical information systems techniques. And what we see here is looking at recruitment locations, say. We started by looking at country level, so you can see those sort of hotspots concentrating, but actually where there was sufficient data available to look within the countries, you can see regional clusters as well. So the image on the right is Slovakia, which is a main country for us in the UK for labour trafficking. And you can see the risk really concentrating in this particular region, Košice, which has fairly high unemployment, fairly low average income. A issue we encountered with the geographical data was that there isn't a standardized reporting format at the moment, so there was a huge amount of variation between places in terms of the quality and quantity of information available. Sometimes it would say Ella's from London, sometimes it would say from the UK, sometimes you'd have a specific address. But we hope that exercises like this show the potential value of recording much more specific geographical data that then allows you to look at where specific risk locations concentrate, and also about the links between these places. So, is it Slovakia to the UK, or is it this particular region to, let's say, Cambridge? Wrapping up very quickly, we also looked at harbouring and exploitation locations, and again you see those concentrations in the data. So in summary, I think for us and for our partners at the National Crime Agency, this project has very clearly shown that there can be some great benefits to the authorities opening up their data for use in academic research and for that sort of collaboration. There's some real promise in showing what a more nuanced and targeted approach to looking at trafficking can tell us, but there's some more important limitations as well. Not just are there the biases in the sense that these are only known cases, so there may be institutional biases involved, for example, but also there's those biases within the data, so the missing data, the information of variable quality, etc. And there's some really important lessons in there for data collection and analysis and research. Thank you very much. Do come and talk to me if you're interested.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Ella Cockbain. Thank you for sharing with us the main results of this important research on applying data science techniques to human trafficking research, for also highlighting the benefits of exchanges and collaboration between the law enforcement agencies and academia, and for helping us ultimately to improve the measurement and understanding of human trafficking. And thanks to the UK Crime Agency, National Crime Agency, for sharing this data that we're analyzing in your paper. I think we reached the end of this session. I would like to thank everybody. We have only 2 questions before moving to the next session. And I would like to give first the floor to Peter Reuter to respond to one of these questions.
Thank you. So the question's very nicely written. The approach, the Campana and Varese approach, is interesting and worth using, but it focuses on visible organized crime groups, i.e. groups that exert their influence negatively at local levels. Couldn't this be broadened to deal with other groups? And of course, this is an invitation to give a very long answer about all the research that one could do, which I will not take up. I want to use this, though, to make the argument that what's I think insightful about the Campana and Varese approach is it asks what's a distinctive harm related to organized crime. I mean, drug trafficking requires organization. Maybe not very large, but it requires organization. You can certainly label that any sort of 5-person group that regularly brings in heroin to the UK as an organized crime group. But what if all they do is traffic heroin? What have you gained with that label? What I think that this approach does is it starts with harms. What is it about organized crime that is a problem for this particular nation, and how can we go about measuring it? If you were doing this work in Albania, I do not think that this would be what you would use as the approach. But as I say, I think it starts with identifying harms and then asking, are there ways of measuring those harms that are specific to organized crime that you might capture in a fairly low-cost fashion?
Thanks very much. Another question to Jim.
This question that says, today every doctor knows about international classification of diseases and can write ICD codes and recording events. Can you imagine each police person using the ICCS to record all cases? First let me start with a story about my doctor. And my doctor was my next door neighbor, and I went to him, and he was using the ICC codes, and he was looking for a diagnosis when I went to see him, and he wrote abdominal obesity, in which case I was pretty offended. So I'm not so sure it's good having doctors do that, at least in the patient's presence. But let me talk about this is a hard question because it depends. It depends upon the technological sophistication of policing, and it's going to vary massively across places. And the United States has had a very difficult time. If you take NIBRS, National Incident-Based Reporting System, which I presented the data from before, it's been 30 years to get the police industry in the United States to move. But more recently, because of some events in the United States, the FBI has gotten behind this, and you're beginning to see a great deal of movement. So I think the essence here is that the automation of records and having the software industry behind you and creating those applications, which make this kind of coding pretty simple, so that if you're in places where you have that kind of infrastructure, I think this is definitely feasible in the sense that if you look at NIBRS, NIBRS is able to produce, I'd say about 85% of the ICCS classification can be produced with NIBRS. And so some group has been able to do something which looks very similar to what you're asking them to do. So in that sense, I think it is feasible where you have a software industry and automation. It's going to be more difficult in other places. And I think what you'll have to do, anything this ambitious, needs to be phased. You know, so that expectations are rolled out in a way. For instance, NIBRS was stalled until we went to sample-based implementation. They were trying to implement this in 18,000 police departments at one time. And then when you give them a plan for how to get national estimates on a sample basis, make it an achievable goal, I think in those cases you're going to get that kind of compliance. The important thing, I think, is to set realistic goals commensurate with the technical sophistication of the police industry in that particular place. And the final thing, which is the political will. If you have a centralized political system, this is much more achievable goal. If you have a decentralized political system the way you have in the United States, that more than any technical issue complicates the implementation of this kind of goal. But I think, you know, given the appropriate level of management information systems and technological sophistication, is definitely achievable.
Thanks very much. We have now come to an end of this session, and I would like to thank all the distinguished scholars and researchers to be with us today, and I would like to invite you to give them a round of applause.